You might get, as a participant, you might get something saying, yes, continue or not. That's happened to me in the past. But welcome, hello. Today we're going to be talking about public art policy making and practice with Jason Weeks from the Cambridge Arts Council, who does a ton of stuff. I've shared the bio before. He's executive director of the Cambridge Arts Council, which also serves as the local cultural council. They are 501c3 and combination 501c3 and entity of department within the Cambridge municipal structure. They have the longest running Percent for the Arts program in the nation, I believe, and Jason will correct me if that's not true. He's also a lecturer at Boston University and longtime arts administration professional, and has a background in music and theater, music performance and theater. Is probably the first friend I made when I moved over in summer of 2012. We were connected with a former alumni and employee of his from Hartford, and we're literally maybe 2 blocks away from each other if he's at the office, because I live very close to the office. And with that, I will give you Jason Weeks. Thank you for joining us, Jason.
Luis, thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. It's always a pleasure to be with this group, and it's been a little while, so I'm glad to be back among you, and I'm always happy to talk about cultural districts and the work that we all do. For many of you, Luis mentioned, I lecture over at Boston University on sort of arts in the community and community-based art. And I do talk a little bit about public art and creative placemaking and keeping, but I talk a whole lot more about cultural districts and cultural programming, at the local level. And for any of you that have been kind enough to entertain students that I've sent out all over the Commonwealth to look at your cultural districts and to meet with, key thought leaders and the folks that are moving this important work forward, I'm really grateful. Because I don't always give a lot of heads up, because I want the students to sort of find and explore how these cultural districts are coming together all over the state, because we're all in different places and doing different things, but there's so many different through lines that it's a terrific education. So I'm grateful to all of you who have supported students and helped them also learn about how our communities come together and do this work. So anyway, Luis had asked me to talk about public art and creative placemaking, and you're right. Whether it's the oldest, I can't quite confirm that in the moment, but it is one of the original programs. We in Cambridge, some of you may have seen and remember and experienced, the public art on the MBTA, and part of what got us involved very early on in thinking about creative placemaking through public art was the Arts on the Line project, because Cambridge Arts was brought in to work with the state Department of Transportation and the federal Department of Transportation, and of course here locally, to manage that program. And so that got us a taste of what this work looks like and how it impacts communities and how it impacts, in that particular case, the transportation and a transportation system. And so very shortly after that work got underway, we actually ended up establishing an ordinance here in Cambridge. This was 1979. And that ordinance basically legally empowered artists to be part of the conversation whenever we grow and build the city of Cambridge. And that could be a new building, a renovation to an existing building, that could be open space, even underground utility work. Whenever we're doing capital investment in the city, public art is a part of that, and that means artists, and the voice of creative cultural workers are part of how we grow and build the city. And so I thought I'd show you some examples of that work. I'll move through, I've got a little slide deck that I put together. I'll move through that fairly quickly, but I'll stop maybe here and there on a particular project. And then as we go through that, I invite folks to drop questions in the chat. Luis can maybe help and Timothea make sure we don't miss any questions there as I'm going, or stop and pause to make sure, it's more of a conversation and not just me, telling you about what we're doing here in Cambridge. And then there's a few very recent projects that we've done, even during the pandemic, that I thought I'd share a little bit of information and some visuals on. And then, finally, I want to make sure to talk just a little bit about Starlight Square, our temporary intervention here that has allowed for outdoor performance throughout the pandemic. So we've been able to keep, our artists, our creative cultural workers, and our creatives very much, at work in that space. And so that is imbued with public art as well, and is itself a form and expression of public art. So anyway, I'll save a little bit of time to talk about that as well. But let me see if I can share my screen real quick. And while I do, I just want to acknowledge Luis for providing the Google file up front. I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time on sort of structure and how we are set up, but I did want folks to know that information and to have access to it, because sometimes that answers questions about how we run things and who supports that and where the funding comes from. So I'm happy to take and respond to any questions about that as well. And then we'll leave you with all of this information so you can go back and check it out. So if you have questions on your mind, I'm happy to be available, to each of you individually or come back in this setting to talk again. But I hope everybody can see, maybe just a nod of the head or a hand raise. Can you see my screen? Okay, cool. It says more than the sum of the arts. And I like to start with that because, when we think about public art and creative placement, of course, I'm telling none of you anything you don't already know, but it's not just arts for art's sake, right? It's about a community coming together to figure out how creative expression could, lift and connect the community where they are. And it's about also aspirations for what we want our communities to look like and what we want to celebrate and lift up as far as what we're proud of, and what, how spaces get used, history of spaces, social context, all of the above. And so anyway, much, much, much more than the sum of just the artist or the team of artists and what gets made. It's about the process. And I've got a few images here in the deck that talk about that as well. So with that, let me just explain what you're looking at in that very lead tile. That's an image from Porter Square. Some of you may recognize that. I'm sure most of you have been to Porter Square at some point. Right on the red line, we had an expanded plaza, and an artist and professional designer created this sort of black and white striated pattern. As well as introducing organics, trees, shrubs, bushes, rocks, and stones, because the whole reason for this project coming about was the city was trying to figure out how to let traffic take a left back on Mass Ave. For anybody that's ever tried to drive down Mass Ave from Harvard Square to Porter Square, it's a cattle chute. You get kind of caught in one area and there's no U-turns, there's no way to turn around safely or securely. So the city was trying to manage traffic safely and get a left turn out of the Porter Square Shopping Center, which gave us the opportunity to do this project. The second image, this is a historic representation down in East Cambridge at our city-owned parking garage down on 1st and 2nd Street, or sort of in between. This is George Greenemeyer, who's been doing public art, for well over 50 years, all around the Commonwealth and all around the country. And these were images about 16 and a half feet up by the pedestrian entrance to the garage that hark back to manufacturing history of Cambridge. It's called East Cambridge 1852. And it's got the row houses in the middle. It's got the factories, which are obvious. And it's got, you see the furniture makers, because furniture making was a great big industry in Cambridge. Also to the far left, you see somebody blowing glass, because glass and porcelain are great big industries, here in East Cambridge. And so anyway, a lovely artwork that holds some of that past and brings it right into the future. Some of these images too, I chose because I wanted to see not just the artwork, but how it's used, because just about every one of the artworks that is created is obviously not behind stanchions. It's, about actually functional work, in the heart of the city and in our plaza, squares, streets, open spaces. This is a wonderful piece that was done in the early 2000s by John Tajuri. Chairs and endless lamps. And what you're looking at are the great big lounge chairs and the sort of stadium seating there in the middle. This is the Moses Youth Center right in the Port neighborhood, just not half a block from where I'm sitting, here in our office. And Moses Youth Center is a very, very active youth center. And they had created a concrete patio. You'll see sort of up to the left there behind the chairs and the stairs and lamps. And the patio is wonderful. And they do a lot of urban gardening and that sort of work, a lot of events and activities. But what you don't yet see, and I'm going to go to the next picture, you can sort of see how now they're being used by some of the youth connected to the Underground Railroad Theater, in this case, in a program that we had funded through our grant making. You can see this other side is the blacktops. Well, the blacktops connect to a large open park, and they are used all of the time. Luis can attest to this because he lives right around the corner as well. And what the students said when we talked to them, and they talked to the artist, John Tajuri, was, wouldn't it be great if there was a place that connected this outdoor patio to the blacktops? Because the kids spend a lot of time there watching the games, waiting for pickup, doing the urban gardening. And couldn't we create some sort of more gentle connection point? And so along comes John to solve that issue. But then right down the street, actually, here's the building I'm sitting in. This is the historic City Hall Annex, one of two buildings that serve as City Hall in the city of Cambridge, right at the corner of Broadway and Inman, for those that know the geography. And it's a historic building from the late 1800s that was burned at one point, rebuilt. And the Cambridge Arts Council has been resident in this city building almost since the very beginning. And so the artist in this particular case, we had the opportunity, again, back in the early 2000s, they were doing a full sort of gut renovation of the building because it had mold spores. And so it really had to be a gut renovation, but we had the awesome opportunity to bring public art to this space where we sort of live and work. And so the artist in this case, Mike Gleer, is a resident of Western Massachusetts and upstate New York. This was only the second public artwork he'd ever done. He's taught for many years at Williams College and was chair of their visual art department for a time. And these are some images now from the main floor and the mezzanine. Basically, here's some of the construction so you can see how deeply integrated the work was. But he basically did many residencies with each of the departments in the building. And in addition to Arts Council, there's community development, there's traffic, parking and transportation, the Animal Control Commission, Conservation Commission. So, a hodgepodge of city departments, but he was able to draw these themes for what he recognized the department's doing on behalf of the community. And so, he had things like flow. Here's the Conservation Commission, and you see the Charles River sort of going right down into the bubblers. You see at the top of the mezzanine, sort of right in the middle here, this wonderful panel that was democracy in action. And Mike's a funny guy. He thinks, democracy, and he's right, is a very beautiful thing, but it's also loud and thorny. And so to the right of the screen, right before our image tiles, you'll see sort of the oversized exclamation points, the perpendicular angles, the large thorns on the rose bushes and the grackles, which, if anybody knows grackles, they make a very loud noise. And so democracy in action is frequently loud and noisy. But it's a beautiful thing, and it's what we strive and are ambitious for, of course, in all of our cities and towns, to see the democratic process in action. And so here are a few of the other images. It's interesting, actually, if you look down at the bottom quadrant of the screen there, you'll see the dog walker. That's right next to, I mentioned, animal control. So here's Mike being funny again. You see the dog walker and the little Boston Terrier kind of straying with the thought bubbles coming up through the garden imagery, and the thought bubbles to back up. The largest thought bubble is that democracy in action panel. So he really wanted the system of murals not just to be individual murals for each department and representing sort of what they do visually, but to be, a consistent system of murals throughout the building. So anyway, that's Town Green, and right here in the City Hall Annex. I thought you might be interested to see that. Here's a project that I just think is extraordinary, and in the 21 years I've been around, is perhaps one of the most impactful structural projects and public artworks that we've created. This is probably a space nobody on the call would necessarily know, but it's in West Cambridge, right off of Yerksa Road. And Yerksa Road runs perpendicular to Rindge Avenue, which goes right out to North Cambridge and Alewife, back again to the Red Line of the MBTA. But what you see at the top of your screen, before the stairwell into hell there, is a railway. That's the commuter rail, the MBCR, and that's the Fitchburg, or now Wachusett, into Porter Square. So we have this commuter rail that cuts right through West Cambridge. obviously comes very fast through this space, and it bisects a neighborhood, right? To get from one side of the neighborhood to the other side of the neighborhood, previously, you had to go down into this dark, completely inaccessible by ADA standards, underground tunnel under the railroad. I mean, imagine that as a parent. I think, would I send my, 6-year-old down into that tunnel, which also the lights, never worked well. It would flood. It was just a mess, you can see. And so with that, the city and the state started a project, and we had the opportunity to do public art and sort of creative placemaking and keeping along with this. But before I take you to the next image, we literally had youth that had to go all the way out to Mass Ave and come back around, because what's on the other side of this hole in the ground are community gardens and tennis courts and water features and a tot lot. You've got the Ringe playing field right behind the Peabody School, where you have Little League. You have a library branch as part of the Cambridge Public Library. You have a school, which I've referenced. You have just every amenity, community gardens, every amenity you can think of living in a community is on the other side of this. And so with that, now today, this is what this looks like. And so we're looking back in the opposite direction. On the other side where we first started is an affordable housing complex that was developed and in support, in partnership with the city. And so, think about that for a minute. We used to have, the complete one side of this was dangerous and lack of all sort of community amenities. The other side, absolutely beautiful, and everything was there, and no safe way to get through that. If you didn't go all the way out to Mass Ave, we had youth that would cut the fence and climb over the tracks. And imagine that for a moment. It's just terrifying. So along comes Randall Thurston. And Randall, if anybody knows Randall's work on this call, Randall typically actually does very fine paper cuts. If you ever saw an exhibition of his work, it would be done with needles on the wall to hold up the fine paper cuts that he would do of local flora and fauna and that type of thing. And so Randall had never done a public artwork before, and nothing along the scale of what we were asking. But this is another opportunity to give artists the chance to not only exercise their creativity, but to grow and expand themselves professionally. And this is a case where Randall spent time in all of our library branches in this whole half of the city, working with the students to do drawings, to take photographs, to think about local flora and fauna, and then created these tiles, sort of a crescendo and decrescendo of the moths and butterflies, the birds on the outside that you see taking flight. And this grid on both sides of the underpass now is actually lit from the bottom, and it stands about an inch off of the wall. So you see the shadows and the beauty at night. It's literally like the birds are taking flight. And so we had a community celebration once this was dedicated, and invited all the youth that had done drawings, invited the families, invited the communities on both sides of the underpass to come together to dance and to celebrate and to be part of this project. But now, we can safely have kids and adults. You can almost drive a car through there, although, I don't encourage that. But it's wide enough and bright enough and safe enough, for the community to really connect now and for those amenities to be shared. And the public art was sort of that public sort of understanding and compact that was being made all along. Another quick project here at the point of, this is just around the corner at one of our firehouses, historic firehouses. There was this little node on the point. This is right at the edge of Huron Village. And so you can see the street crossings and come into this node, and bear in mind where we're looking, the perspective from which we're sitting looking at this image is where the apparatus, where the fire trucks come out of that space to respond to fires and other concerns in the city. But this tiny little node became a very sort of dangerous traffic crossing area for pedestrians. And so Paul Ramirez-Jonas had an entirely different idea for this. And he created Cambridge's smallest park. And we've tested this by doing, like we used to do, stuffing folks in cars. We've stuffed folks into this park. We've see how many folks we can fit. But the whole idea was, he used the popular nomenclature for parks. You see the wrought iron fence, the mechanisms to close and open the gateway and that sort of thing, the park bench there in concrete. But he created a gold lock and a key. And between all of us on this call, it's not locked, and it's small enough that you could step over it. But the whole thing was a study into who owns public space, who can use public space, who has access to public space. And the answer, of course, is all of us. So what we did is Paul created a key, and the key was mailed out in concentric circles 5,000 of these keys mailed out, concentric circles from this park all the way out, to Cambridge neighborhoods. And we gave everyone a key. So they had physical access and could also think about copying that, sharing that, making sure that everybody knew that public space is ours, as residents and taxpayers and, on and on. But just a couple more here. I'll show you. This is Costa Lopez Taylor Park. This was a situation where the city actually took over a empty lot that was adjacent to an existing park. And because we had a dearth of open space in East Cambridge at the time, they expanded Costa Lopez Taylor Park. And here's the design. I wasn't going to show a whole lot of designs, but you can see how the whole thing expanded from one side of the street to another side of the street. On the left-hand side of your screen was that lot. And it turned into raised community gardens and opportunities for people to sit, play games, to rest, to enjoy the organics. And so here you can see they were starting to install the raised beds for community gardens. Well, we invited Roberly Bell, an artist, to create what became Gourd Gate. What a sweet project, right? We were going to put a fence and a gate there anyway between the park, the active play park, and the community gardens. And Roberly had this beautiful idea to do it like in a fantastical sort of gourd way. And these are also serve as opportunities for topiary. So now when you see these in full bloom, the gourd is covered with, green and organics and vines and that sort of thing and blooms and leads you beautifully right into the other parts of the park. There it is from a different perspective. But, what a great way to create functional public art that actually talks about what's happening right there in the park. One of the last ones I wanted to show you, here's, a pretty ugly building, right? That brutalist concrete structure, a little bit like a tiny Boston City Hall, but not even as lovely and sweeping as that space. This is, if anybody knows Central Square, this is the Green Street parking garage. It's city owned. It looks radically different now, and I don't have an image of that, but if you've seen it more recently with a series of mural programs that we've done, the entire building is wrapped with murals. And another public artwork that talks about, Cambridge's connections to the civil rights movement, and Dr. King's work, and when Dr. King was at Boston University and living in Cambridge. And so anyway, this building was pretty horrible as far as visuals to most folks. There is a group of folks that will tell you this is quite beautiful, but I don't count myself among them. And I hope you appreciate the work that Edwin Andrews did for Doc Matrix. He basically had in front of him, I'm going to go back to this thing. If you look at the entryways, there's 3 stories up, 4 if you go all the way to the ceiling. And the first thing I see there is, again, I respond as a parent and go, oh my God, my child could fall right out of there. That doesn't look safe to me, right? Those simple little railings, 3 stories and 4 stories up. So not only did he want to beautify the space in this whole corner of the building, but also make it fortified and safer for people to, traverse the stairwells and the space. So along comes Dot Matrix, and now you can see from the inside, he created these grids and colors, which is almost like a motherboard for computer circuitry, which, no surprise in Cambridge with all of our tech and the universities, it made a whole lot of sense. But guess what else it made? Jewel tones. It lightened the space. It created a softness from that sort of brutalist concrete structure. So now during the day when you're inside, you're surrounded by light and surrounded by color. And then at night, of course, when it's lit from within, look at that. I mean, the difference between the two. I'll go back to the beginning. Here it is originally. And now look at that. I mean, it's still a brutalist structure. It's still concrete. Now I'm telling you, all of the other concrete spaces are beautifully festooned with murals. So it's a little softer, but imagine this as a solution for safety, security, and beautification. And Edwin Andrews just nailed it. There's one more image at night. I'm going to skip past this. I do want to mention this building right here. This is down in East Cambridge, and this is our Cambridge Police and Public Safety Facility. It was originally going to be a tech building, but we had long outgrown the central square base of our police force and station. The building was in terrible condition. And so the city had the opportunity to purchase this building because the tech company that built it and had started to plan to move in, unbelievably decided not to do that and took an option somewhere else. And so the city was able to purchase this building and create the facility. Well, the reason I'm showing it to you is Krzysztof Wodiczka had an idea for how to activate what happens in this building for the rest of the community. Because, you know, a lot of us, we see the results on the evening news, of course, of what happens with police, fire, and emergency communications, but we don't know what they're doing in the meantime. We don't know how they're thinking about response. But he was very interesting, Christoph, the artist here, and he works at Harvard first, and now at MIT first, and now at Harvard. So he spends, you know, most of his time here in Cambridge. He was interested in this notion of the public role in public safety. How do we know what they're doing? Do we know what they're doing? What is our responsibility to that, that keeping our community safe? And so he created a lighting project. He used the lighting that was already part of the building. You can see those nodes that are all around. They were on the front of the building, but we expanded them to this both side facades of the building. And then he created lighting systems. He spent time with emergency communications, which is in this building, and the police force, which is in this building, talking about how they respond, what that looks like. And then he created this system of lights such that every time we have police response, the blue lights take over the building, and the blue lights basically create its own sort of sequence. Whenever we have a fire response, of course, it's red and it has a different sequence. And whenever we have, you can see there on the left now, a green lighting sequence for medical support. And so, you know, his grandest wish was that with this building humming at all times with the different lighting sequences, of course, not overnight, it goes to a very soft hum of just the blue lights, almost like a heartbeat or a pulse. He really wanted the community to know that, look, the city's here, we're working on your behalf. The public safety is being cared for, and this is what's going on. And so anyways, a really sweet idea and project. And of course, none of these happen, as I was saying at the very beginning, none of these projects happen without deep community process. You know, we are only the stewards and the facilitators of this work. The folks that actually do the work, of course, are the artists that are commissioned, and those artists are commissioned by the community. We just help set up the conversations. And so here was one of the conversations with 3 of the finalists for a project that's going to take place at the Foundry, which is an old foundry that's being renovated by the city and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority to be a center for STEAM learning in the city of Cambridge, and a point of access between our corporations, our tech companies, and our life science companies, and our young people here in the city and workforce development. And so ultimately, Elisa Hamilton, who was sitting in the middle of this image in the pink sweater, was chosen for the project. And she, I've got a couple of titles here that talk, and I'm again going to leave you with this, that talk about process. And so you may have questions about that I could respond, but I wanted you to see kind of step by step, what do we do and how do we think about that? But I'll leave you with this. Elisa decided in her project to create the Foundry Jukebox. And I think everybody on this call knows about a jukebox and experienced a jukebox. And, you know, I remember them very well, although we don't see them very often anymore, but they were a place that people gathered. They were something you gathered around. You celebrated the music and the musicians and the work that was created. You had the opportunity, of course, to select that and enjoy it by dancing or just being in the company of the music. And so Elisa actually has purchased and retrofitted a 1962 jukebox from the city of Worcester, actually, and is importing that here to hold a series of 100 stories from Cambridge residents about their experiences over the last several hundred years in Cambridge. The industries, the neighborhood stories, just all kinds of things that will be available from this. And of course, you know, obviously with technology these days, you don't physically have to be at the jukebox. We'll have a website and, you know, streaming opportunity, podcasts and that sort of thing. But we're also going to do live storytelling from this space as a way to celebrate the community, our history, and the social context. And so she found a really beautiful way to do that work. These were just some drawings for how the jukebox would live in the space. And so with that, I'd love to, you know, pause me talking and just invite any questions that you have. I'm going to run through a few more images that I have of a particular program where we actually convinced the city to use capital funding to support public art making in the Port neighborhood specifically. And so here's actually the artist Imagine 876 or Sneha, who's a Nepali muralist some of you may know or have worked with. She had done a project with us in Central Square, and she was then working with the students at our Community Arts Center based in the Port to do a ground-based mural celebrating Port neighborhood pride and the students in the neighborhood. Here's another project, mosaic project David Fichter created for the Fletcher Maynard School, right around the corner from the space you just saw. And here are the students creating their designs that they drew in the mosaics, which now are festooned around the entrances of the school. Dance, Be Heard World. This is Anna Meyer, who was born and raised in Cambridge, creating work on the blacktops and in our parks, celebrating dance. There's Elisa again with the jukebox. And then just a final images of, I showed you the benches before, the conservation and maintenance, something we're always thinking about. We finally got the city to dedicate some amount of funding to support this work so that we constantly take care of the artwork and make sure that we're realizing the artist's original intents and making sure that it's safe, for residents to sit on and experience and use. And here's Inner City Totem 1 and 2 that was done by local artists as well, Maduna, representing Afro-Caribbean masks and history. And you can see on the left tile, our left image of this tile, it had fallen into terrible disrepair, and we've just done a full-scale restoration of the sculpture right now, sitting in front of our Cambridge Community Center in the Riverside neighborhood. And so here you can see how some of the wood had rotted, the metal had rusted, and how we had worked to clean, care for, and refabricate that. And here's some of the work happening. And then finally, Beat the Belt. Some of you may remember the history here. This was a great, relatively simple mural in its execution, but this was the residents of Cambridge standing up for the neighborhoods when they were going to originally bisect the Cambridgeport neighborhood with I-93. The residents actually stood that down, and this mural sort of holds that history. And so you can see the celebratory tone of when we did a full restoration of that just a few years ago. But anyway, some ideas there. I'm stop sharing my screen so we can all come back together. Anyway, some images, some ideas. Does this prompt questions or can I respond to those?
I have a question. Jason?
Really? Okay, go.
Wonderful examples. I love this presentation, Jason. What I really liked about it is it shows how the power of cultural districts. I think a lot of times we almost overuse programming in cultural, and we don't leverage what can be our significant power and resources for major infrastructure improvements, which you've done beautifully here in Cambridge, and their safety. They're much more than just an art program, as wonderful as art programs are. And I think that's amazing. I mean, I think about I'll just give one example of the Fenway Alliance with the Muddy River Restoration Program.
Right.
Very similar type of project. Could you talk briefly about how you, where the funding for these efforts, because these are not.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. And thank you so much. And it's great to see you. And I'm glad that project is still moving forward at the Fenway. But it comes from a variety of sources. You heard me say a couple of things along the way as I was showing the images. The great good news is when the city created the ordinance back in 1979, it was a percent for art ordinance, which some of you may be familiar with. The idea there in its simplest format is there's some dedicated revenue as part of a project budget that would support creative placemaking. And so, in most cases, the Cambridge Arts Council would have 1% of the construction side of the budget. It was always tied to construction because a lot of the funding that supports this comes from bond proceeds, bond sales that the city does. When they're thinking about, let me give you a tangible example. The City Hall Annex, which I showed you with the Mike Glear murals, they had to do that gut renovation job. And so, of course, as part of the capital planning for the city, they identify a budget for that after feasibility and some design thinking and whatnot. As part of that budget, we're thinking about public art. And so a percent of that budget gets actually, harnessed specifically for that use. Then as part of the city's capital budget, I also mentioned, and something, whenever I'm talking about creative placemaking and keeping, and the reason I wanted to show those images at the end, we always have to be thinking well ahead of time about what is it going to take care of that? Because sometimes it's the easy thing to actually get something made and created. And of course, all of us on this call know none of this is easy. I don't mean to undersell the complications that accompany this work, but it's critical to think about how we're going to care for this over time, because it is going to be there hopefully for a good long while. Durable artwork, I hesitate to say permanent, because what does that mean? But durable artwork requires a lot. It's just like, I say sometimes we wouldn't build a school or a park and have no plan for how we care for it and maintain it, our custodial services, et cetera, et cetera. But for decades, we made public artwork, whether it was earthworks or whether it was, other types of fabrication, without thinking about that. So we do a great deal of work, and we actually also consult with the artists as they're dreaming and thinking, with conservation specialists, art conservation specialists, help them think about and execute an idea using systems that will set this up for success. So it's funding at both levels and at sort of both sides of the process. But then we also end up writing a lot of grants, looking for additional support for making this work. So it comes from a variety of sources, but it all starts and sort of ends with that percent for art mechanism, because that makes sure that the city, which, cities and towns are not great at thinking about art, as we know, right? We have to constantly advocate every step of the way, and that's no different in Cambridge. But we do have some of these tools, like the ordinance that says legally we have to include artists. And if we're going to do that, we have to do it responsibly. So, we're constantly advocating, even for those budgets. It's not like they just necessarily carve out the money and say, Jason, here's the money, you guys go for it and do your thing. We're constantly working with our colleagues in other departments to make sure that it's on their minds, to remind them that this is the great way to engage and involve the community. Because at the end of these projects, when the city finishes the port infrastructure project, where we're burying giant holding tanks for water to basically mitigate storm water gathering in the neighborhood. The Port neighborhood's a very flat neighborhood right in the center of town, and it's too far from drainage to Alewife and that area, or down in East Cambridge. It's too far from drainage and bisected by the MBTA red line to go down to the Charles River. And so it just gathers. And for decades, it's been a terrible experience of many of the residents and neighborhoods. So we're addressing that as a city. And of course, we have an opportunity to create commission and create public art as part of that. So what we actually talk to the city about is, let's don't wait till the end of the project, once everything's sewn up and then suddenly the city is gifted with this wonderful public artwork. Let's do public artworks throughout the project. Let's talk about this work with the community, what they care about, what are their concerns, their fears, their experiences, and how can this work and this funding actually best support them, as this work's happening. So it's a variety of sources, but again, it sort of begins with that percent for art piece, which is hard, but I think coming back to the cultural districts, cities and towns and the state, what I've seen over the years is there's a whole lot more appetite for creative placemaking and keeping when you do demonstration projects. Sometimes it scares folks. They don't know what to expect. Oh my goodness, we're going to include artists and creatives in this work. And I said, well, you're already including creatives in everything that we build and grow. Yes, of course we're going to include artists in this work as well. But sometimes a demonstration project, and there's no better place, obviously, than those things happening in our cultural districts, can be the way to bring folks along that are less experienced with this work, or have concerns that it could be too costly, or they're going to get pushback from the community about, how dare you spend money on this when you could spend it on that. But these are good ways to bring folks along, because sometimes we know that's what it requires and what it needs.
Thank you.
Sure. Louise, you were, I think, going to say something or organize us, please.
No, Margot had her hand raised.
Thank you, Jason. So thank you so much. I'm a former resident of North Cambridge, so I was the direct beneficiary of much of your work. So I appreciate what you do very much. And now I'm based in New Bedford, and we are at the beginning of creating a public art policy for the city. The city doesn't have one, so I very much appreciate this presentation today. And my first question, thank you, Kelly, for asking it, was the funding and how you are sustainable. My second question is, can you briefly talk about how you're both a nonprofit 501c3 and in the municipal government? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we were really lucky. I mean, as we all kind of stand on shoulders, of those that came before us, particularly in municipal work, that the original director and board here at Cambridge Arts Council, recognized even back in the 70s, we were established as a city department by another city council ordinance back in 1974. By 1976, we had an early board and a director in place, Pamela Warden, for anybody that may remember Pam, who lives out in Groton. And we're working on an exhibition of her and all of the great work she did with Arts on the Line and thinking about, creative placemaking and keeping. But they had the wisdom to also establish a separate 501c3. And I think it was a recognition that we would never have the funding that we needed in total from the city or the town, right? Because it just doesn't work that way, as we know. I mean, we're always and ever, through Mass Creative and Mass Cultural Council and all our great advocacy tools and the work that you guys do in districts, we're always trying to change that metric. And of course, we had some great fortune this year with the budget for the State Arts Agency and finally getting up to $20 million, which is unbelievable in the context of the pandemic and all the rest. But, it is, I think it was just a recognition. We were never going to have the funding from the city or, a city in a town. We were never going to have everything we needed from the state either, just because we know how complicated that was. So it was a way to create another mechanism that would allow us to go out and raise funds, from individuals, from small businesses, from corporations and that sort of thing. And so we still raise money too through the department because we're constantly writing grants, federal and state grants, and all of that gets appropriated into the municipal department. But we're also writing grants to, private foundations and other entities and soliciting support because still with all the great news I share about, public art and creative placemaking and all the rest that we do in Cambridge, it's incumbent upon us to find a lot of the money to get it done, particularly our produced events. And all of us, I know, we're struggling with that, in the context of cultural districts. Where does the money come from? So anyway, it was a way to do that. And so we're sort of a steward of both. I serve as the executive director of the municipal department, here in Cambridge, the Cambridge Arts Council. But I'm also a trustee ex officio of our nonprofit. And so we keep both of those things going. And, both are really strategic tools that allow us, to carry out the work that the residents, are eager to see happen, whether that's creative placemaking and keeping, or whether that's a festival or, some other type of work on behalf of the city.
I
Other
just put
questions?
I just put the link to the municipal code in Cambridge. Again,
Perfect.
This was 1979. And you'll notice, let's see, there might have been changes with, again, municipal codes and ordinances are a breathing document. So, there could be a change in 85 to reflect the now of 85, right? So, but that's
Right. No,
language.
Luis makes a great point. And sometimes it breathes rather slowly and there aren't any changes, because cities and towns move slowly when it comes to legislation sometimes and ordinances and language like this. So, we have another ordinance that we implement for street performing and busking, actually. It's part of our sidewalk use ordinance. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but we actually did recently go through the process of updating and changing that language. And that's a long road too, because it requires copious community-based meetings and conversations and feedback and input. And then of course, working with the city's law department, which, is never a breeze. I mean, that always takes far longer and much deeper work than you might imagine, but we were able to update that. So now we're actually talking with the city and the council here in Cambridge about updating the public art ordinance because, ordinances, are enshrined, but they should, as Luis said, be tested and looked at and, considered in the context of where are we now, different than where were we in 1979 or, whenever the ordinance was originally taking shape. But yeah, we have a few. If you stripped everything away that we do, we've got about 13 program areas, but there are only 3 that are, required by ordinance. One is public art, because we have this % for art ordinance. The other is the sidewalk use ordinance that allows for and empowers the Cambridge Street Performer program. And then the third, of course, is our role as a local cultural council in implementing the LCC program. in partnership with the state. And so those three things we have to legally do by state or local guidelines. The rest of the things, of course, we've developed because, we've heard from Cambridge residents, we've heard from folks that work in Cambridge, we've heard from visitors that, these are their thinking and aspirations, and we've tried to develop programs that hold those. But really, it's those ordinance-driven and sort of grant partnerships with LCC that are right at the core of everything we do.
Jason, thank you for that. And if you can touch on two things. One, when you show a mural, because a mural that's not subject to the percent for the arts, right? Like in Central Square. One, if you can speak to what is the mechanism that makes that okay? Like does the city, is there a resolution or an ordinance built in that speaks to that? Because one good thing about our ordinances, and if you clicked on like the street performer, for instance, it's introduction, enforcement, definitions, right, which is huge. The definition of performer, so it's really it's really basic in the way the skeleton is broken down. But then also, if you can speak to, maybe this will be your experience like in Harvard Square, and this goes to Melissa's question regarding said public art policy within a district that is a large percentage historic and is subject to historic, policies. And I remember going to a couple meetings of where Harvard was trying to do art stuff on their wrought iron gates, and it was brought to the historic, planning people. But yeah, the first one is, how does someone put a mural up? How does that make it okay? Do they go through y'all? Is there legislation that says this is cool with definitions? And two, regarding the historic district issue.
No, those are great questions. Thank you all for putting those up, and Luis to tee it up. But for me, it's sort of the two P's: permission and partnership. And permission being perhaps the most important when it comes to private property. A lot of alliteration right there. But really, sort of the permission and partnership. If you think about Central Square as a great example, 12 years ago now, one of our private property owners offered up, the whole east facade of his building, which was adjacent to an alleyway that went between Mass Ave and Central Square back to a municipally owned parking lot, where now Starlight Square, the temporary outdoor venue I mentioned at the beginning, now sits, at least for the time being. And it became, over the next decade, essentially Graffiti Alley. He knew a lot of graffiti artists. He was interested in using that wall for folks to express themselves. We already had sort of a cool designed glass, colorful, protective sort of ceiling for folks as they were moving through the space. So it created a real destination, and we supported that, and oftentimes sort of held back other departments that might have gone in to, power wash or get rid of things by saying, no, first of all, it's private property, but second of all, this gives people voice. Right? This gives us an opportunity to see in very real time how creatives are expressing their thoughts around anything from racial justice to history of Cambridge to whatever they may be celebrating in the moment as an artist and as a human being in this world. And so we get to see that in that context. And so 10 years on, we decided, well, wait a minute, let's invite some of these urban artists back who have made their mark in this space over the years, but let's also grow this process. Let's use this opportunity to encourage private property owners to support public art. And so for all of the imagery that I showed you from the slide deck, every single piece of that is on municipal or publicly owned land. That's what we have, control and connection to here at Cambridge Art. But when we build partnerships with our local retail and business districts, with a particular owner of a building or a facility, then we can start to have interesting conversations about what's possible. And so, knowing that we had done what we did in Graffiti Alley, that led to an opportunity to work with IDEO just on Prospect Street, a few blocks away, to do a large-scale mural with one of those original artists from Graffiti Alley. On their space, all 3 stories and facade of that building is now sort of a creative canvas done by the French artist Del Tono. But that really got us to begin thinking or get the private property owners thinking what could be possible. And so an interesting connection, Margot, I was thinking about it when you were talking. When I went down as ambassador actually for Mass Cultural Council to do some work as a short-term consultant for the Zeiterion Theater, And actually, when Anita Walker became the director for Mass Culture, I went with her on her first journey down for one of the site visits for cultural investment portfolio, organizational support at the time. And as that was transitioning, that was the first, we went to Artworks, which I think now is part of the museum and whatnot. And so in any case, I went out and witnessed a couple of the murals that were being done by the mural program while I was in New Bedford. And Percy Fortini Wright, who is a muralist who's done work through that program, is actually one of our muralists who did work in Cambridge on several different occasions. So, I mean, they're also, I mean, as we know, the world of art and art making is quite porous here in the Commonwealth and everywhere else. But, it's really trying to get folks to understand the power of doing this kind of work. Yeah, we can have a brick wall that's just a brick wall, but we could also have it become a force of expression for celebrating histories and current context and all the things that we saw before. So a lot of it's that partnership building and using our leverage in history as a successful organization doing this work on municipal properties on behalf of the residents, gets us a foot in the door anyway on those conversations. And so, then it became, the triangle in that conversation was working with the Central Square Business Improvement District. When we did that, and that came after our cultural district designation, we were able to actually build the values of creative placemaking, keeping, and art more generally into the bid. So now if you think about a business improvement district like Downtown Crossing, like out in Northampton, I think it's an ever-growing number, but I think we had 16 or 18 in the Commonwealth for a time, and I think more are now being developed. The bid actually had dedicated revenue because we said there are three values of the bid that are always going to be with the bid as it does its work on behalf of Central Square and then the businesses. It's going to be, safety, beautification, and cleanliness, and arts and culture, and so we were able to work together with the bid as the two sort of leaders of our cultural district to make sure that that was part of the discussion. And so then when they were having the discussions with the private property owners, it was always in their lexicon and their portfolio of information and, the things that they were advocating for to think about public art, and then as, we're all people. Once somebody's in that club, other people want to be in that club. Once they see the benefits of having a grand, realistic Percy Fortini Wright mural, one floor up, or one level up from Mass Ave, other folks want to see something similar or want to do something similar. So it's become, a bit of a cascade effect, which is great, but that can happen. So,
Jason, is this so? And I guess my question is more, but how are they able to do it? Like within the municipality, what says you can do a mural up on the side of a wall?
Yeah, no, great. It's a great question. If you're an owner of a building, you can pretty much do what you want to do with that building, and if we're working with them as a mechanism of the city, as a department of the city, it also helps kind of smooth that. But even without our partnership and support, they could do what they want to do on the side of the building. What I was trying to describe is we've created a conversation and sort of a group of supporters and advocates that when somebody becomes a new owner of a building, or maybe they've owned the building for several generations, in their family or through their company, we can begin to have that conversation with them. And we can also help them navigate, how to do this and do it well, because a lot of private property owners have never done public art making.
Right.
So they don't know, how do you prepare a site? How do you make sure that site and that mural can, survive for many years to come, if not decades, how do you actually do the implementation? And so, we've got a lot of the professional resources and experience to support that. But the question back to the historic district, I think, is a really good one. In some cases, we're not able to do things, and that's just the hard reality of there may be a neighborhood group. There may be a historical commission, in the case that Luis is talking about, that says no, we're not going to do that. That's the wrong color of paint. That's the wrong, thing for this particular historical context. So we may not be able to do it, and sometimes that's the reality as well, and that we have to understand. But back to the partnership, I think having folks that are in the know be part of the conversation from the earliest points, I think, is the best way to move that forward. In the end, you still may not be able to, realize the project, in its entirety or at all, but having those conversations, building those partnerships really, begins to set you up for the best possible outcome, I think, and brings the community along. Because again, working in cities and town, it's not about what Jason wants or what Luis wants or what any of us, on this call wants individually. It's about what does the community want. And if we can articulate that, if we can provide the support mechanisms that make sure that they've got all the information to do it well and professionally, and that folks are in the know, and it's not going to surprise or offend or all these other things, that we can assuage those concerns to some extent because the voices are with us throughout the process. And that's the great thing here. I mean, with our municipal program, of course, the community actually commissions the artist. We just facilitate the process. And so that's a great thing in those cases, because we have to work in that way. So we try and mimic that same process when we're working with a private property owner. But fortunately, like I say, once one owner kind of sees the benefits, the other one might want it as well. And that's a way to also think about revenue, because if the owner wants to see something like that happen, they also need to help facilitate, whether it's direct or whether it's in partnership with investors or whatever the mechanism is, to actually fund that and fund the care of that over a period of time, of the artwork.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jason. And on the chat, we were like making a lot of connections to what you were just saying. I'll add that and again, it's always important to, because the thing with ordinances is it's a lot of them say the same stuff, right? So you can find it and use a lot of the same language. And one thing, with the street performer ordinance is really straight and simple, but it's also in the chapter that regulates street and sidewalk use regulation, right? So every town has in their municipal code a street and sidewalk use regulation chapter. Maybe not verbalized that way, but it's there, right? So an ordinance amendment would just be very simple language that can be almost cut and paste the language that I see here. But then you make it more towards your own community, and before you know it, that is codified, and then you work with that codification to do your own programming. A lot of times there, it spells out distance. In this case, it spells out decibel levels. But that's pretty awesome.
I think also Claire and Margot were asking about process, and that's a great question, because there are a couple of slides. I went by them quickly, and I could pull them back up, but let me just say a few words first about process. I'll leave you with that slide deck. I think that's part of the Google Documents, and so you can look at that more closely to sort of see step by step what is in our thinking and what are we taking into account as we facilitate that work. But I would also say right off of the bat, there's no perfect process, right? The process in our community and with a particular area within a community may be different than a process we do somewhere else. And so what we have is a very open mind and willingness as an organization to develop a process and to change a process and then to articulate that process so that folks aren't surprised and that so folks feel and understand themselves as part of that. And I think, that's the magic of a successful process, is that people feel like it's theirs, that, it's their voice, it's their thinking, and it's their aspirations that is guiding this. And so we try and listen with very big ears, as it were, to what folks need and what they're telling us, and then create, a process that holds that and that is accountable, to the Public Art Commission for the city, to the city administration, to the council, and our elected leaders, and to all of the folks that, watch these processes closely. And so, all of that, of course, as we know, builds trust, and so if we build trust, if folks recognize their thinking and their voice as part of a process, then of course, I think we're doing a good job, and again, nobody is surprised by the outcome. Do we know exactly what the artwork or the intervention is going to look like or how it's going to act over time? Maybe not. Some of those things can be surprising, but there are no surprises that something is coming, and the person or persons that are doing it are part of that. And so, it's our job as an organization to not only hold all that, but to amplify it kind of each step of the way, to make sure that all those folks that I mentioned before are part of that system. And so there's no perfect process. And just when I showed you those tiles that we had in that image of us all sitting around discussing the work with artists, that's one process, of course. But, you know, I think you just constantly have to work with the community and be responsive to what you hear and what you need, and make sure that, you know, you've got enough voices, and enough, of course, is a very, you know, subjective term, but enough voices so that you're getting a cross section of the public. It's not just one person driving an outcome, because that's not a successful project, or the artist running slipshod over the city or the town to do whatever they want to do, no matter what. That's not how good public art making and keeping works, I don't think. And, you know, one man's opinion, but I've done it for a long time, and I've seen it work and I've seen it not work. And I think, you know, the extent to which the community voice is there is what makes this successful. So the process needs to be constantly sort of checked in on. And, you know, we miss things too. We all have blind spots individually and as organizations. You know, we've been looking at that very closely in the last 4 or 5 years, and with the great partnership of MCC and Charles, many of you know Baldwin. That's not his middle name, Charles Baldwin, whom many of you may know, you know, runs the Universal Participation Program. Well, we were sort of a strange outlier to join that particular cohort a couple of years ago, but I was really eager for our organization to be part of that, to think about not just sort of ADA, we're a city, we're a public entity, we're constantly thinking about that, and whether we have meetings in a place or whether we, you know, create a festival or some other type of programmatic format, that's always in our minds, and we can't do otherwise when we're gathering audiences and when we're creating projects. But what I was really interested in is, how do we learn from the user experts? And then how do we take that learning and make sure that anybody that comes to us for an LCC grant, or that comes to us for a public art commission, or that has work in our existing public art collection, because as you can imagine, since 1979, we've got a lot of public art in Cambridge. You know, we've got the largest collection of contemporary public art anywhere in New England, right here in Cambridge. And that's also added to all the time and lifted up by MIT, because they have a campus-based % for art program. We know Harvard, you know, has a lot of public art, you know, on their campuses and in their buildings. And of course, Leslie and Leslie Art and Design are starting to do this work, you know, as the Art and Design School really, you know, grows and becomes a deeper entity here in the community. So we are chock-a-block full and below ground with the MBTA. So, I mean, it's just a wonderful thing. Excuse me, but, you know, I just, the process has to follow the community, I think.
Thank you so much, Jason. Jason, could you check to make sure that I put your email correctly?
Oh, sure.
jweeks at Cambridge.
Yeah, cambridgema.gov. Yeah, you got it.
And Jason has been one of the first people. He's been happy to talk to anyone about this. I've sent a couple people over your way to talk about public art policy and mural ordinances and such. And similarly, if anyone has any follow-up questions, hit them with that. Thank you so very much. I'm psyched that I recorded this because a couple people already emailed me asking me if this has been recorded. Again, one of the things we're doing in the summer, we'll eventually have like a resource page on our massculturalcouncil.org website where all these templates live. Right now, I have that Google Drive cloud folder. If people have any problem accessing it, let me know. A lot of those files are too big to send over email, I've learned. But along with these links, again, we won't have notes, but I will send you the links from the chat. And with that, as always, I'll hang out to the end if anyone has any specific questions. But thank you.
Well, you know, you guys are very kind to put thanks in the chat. I appreciate that, but I also want to turn that back around and thank you guys. Now, having established, you know, with the partnership of MCC, a cultural district, you know, doing this work, none of it happens in a vacuum. And again, the big thing around partnership is we can't do it without each other. So you guys are out there battling for this work, being the advocates and the champions for this in cultural districts and communities more broadly. And so, you know, my hat's off to each and every one of you. And if we can be helpful in the example that we have here in Cambridge, I'm always happy to do that. But it's a great privilege for me to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. With that, I will end this recording there, stop recording.